Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing a weekly wrap-up of the books I read. And these may again seem like a decent number of books, but also partly that's because the last one was shot quite early into the last week. Anyway, this is a little preamble to basically say, here are the books I read this week. I should also say, just before I begin as well, I'm currently working my way through two of the chunkers on the International Booker Prize list. I'm not yet finished with them. I was wondering at first if I'd be able to have them finished for this week's wrap up, but almost there. Sort of just over halfway in both of them, and really enjoying them both in different ways entirely. Especially Tomb of Sand, which is remarkable. But anyway, I will get on and talk about some of the other books that I read this week instead. First up, I want to talk about a pair of books because these two books sort of speak to each other and are related. And those are Autobiography of a Face by Lucy Grealy and Truth and Beauty, A Friendship by Ann Patchett. And the link here is that these two women were friends, and they basically both write a bit about their friendship in these books. So Lucy Grealy, sort of to start us off, was a poet, a US poet, and she was sort of quite early into her life. She basically sort of suffered various sort of issues around her jaw, and I think there was sort of a cancer of the jaw and various other things that all took place. So basically throughout her life she just had surgery upon surgery upon surgery to sort of try and fix sort of some of the issues that were happening. But in the meantime, that basically has also meant that she sort of grew up with a face that was, you know, less sort of like what we typically see. You know, that it was of a slightly different shape. It kind of, as a result, affects, you know, her whole face and how she's sort of seen. And that's something she sort of carried with her. She was a poet, but she sort of, in a lot of her writing, it seems that sort of came up constantly about how she reconciles what's going on with her face and with her health, and her sort of overall perspective on life. And so what we basically see is this woman who is really trying to fight for self-understanding, to kind of argue against people who are basically, you know, mocking her or whatever else, but also just her understanding what it's like to go through the world being a bit different in some way and being able to articulate that. And I think what was really powerful about this book for me was just the way that she then writes this, but in a way that's never really a kind of pity me or kind of isn't my life really hard, but instead really focuses on her outlook on life instead and how she chooses to approach things. And it's really interesting and really beautiful to sort of see this sort of thing where she basically just keeps going to clubs and is this sort of wild child and kind of just thinks, you know, screw it, I've got a life to live out here. And that brings us on to Truth and Beauty by Ann Patchett. So this combo of books was suggested by somebody in the comments a while ago. Apologies, I've forgotten exactly who sort of said it when I was really excited about These Precious Days by Ann Patchett, one of her books that came out last year that I absolutely loved. And this is her other non-fiction book. And Truth and Beauty is also the name of a chapter in this book. So you see there is a sort of, they do directly speak to each other. But basically Ann Patchett and Lucy Grealy became friends in their 20s. And they were both sort of part of the same sort of writing kind of course, and they were always applying for similar prizes and all these sorts of things. So these two women were really sort of enmeshed in each other's lives. And Anne writes with such respect and such, what's the word? Kind of just this real joy about who Lucy Grealy was, you know, this sort of firecracker of a personality who sort of rocks up in a new town and already has 20 new friends by the end of the day and doesn't really let life get her down. But at the same time, their friendship becomes so enmeshed that we get, you know, Anne will talk about how, you know, she'll start dating a man and Lucy will get quite jealous or quite upset about this idea and will sort of make sure that she kind of inserts herself into that situation, such as sitting on Anne's lap and kind of, you know, in front of a whole group of people saying, but you love me most, right? And so it's this very complicated, difficult friendship between these two women, and Ann Patchett writes about it and sort of chronicles sort of up until the end of Lucy's life and then just after. And I think, if I'm correct, this was written just pretty much just a couple of years after Lucy Grealy's death. And she brings in things like letters and everything else. So it was a really beautiful tribute to friendship and to her friend as well. And I just think it's so interesting reading these two books side by side, just to get that kind of perspective. Because at one point, Anne Patchett talks about Lucy writing this book, and how, you know, she sort of would write it in like bits and bobs and wouldn't always get it all out. And then she was going to write a follow-up, but then she didn't. And so we kind of get this really flighty personality of someone like Lucy, who's sort of trying to, you know, enjoy absolutely everything that life has to offer, but is sort of crushed at times by insecurities. And Anne, who's this sort of very focused, very kind of motherly or sort of like parental figure to Lucy, who's sort of like, okay, right, but so just do 200 words a day, and then do this, and let's sort out your taxes, and let's do all these other things, and sort of looks after her. And it's such a brilliant and beautiful thing to see in their friendship, and particularly, you know, Anne Patchett's other book, These Precious Days, where she also talks about taking on a similar caretaking role for somebody in the titular essay, which is also just really beautiful. So it was really heartwarming to read these two side by side, if also a bit tragic, because Lucy Grealy's life was quite sad. And I think the person who recommended it in the comments as well suggested that order, so starting with Autobiography of a Face and then Truth and Beauty. And I think that is the right way around, because we basically experience Lucy in her own words, then see her through the eyes of Anne. And also it meant I could read this book without knowing that Lucy Grealy was about to die, and then read this and was like, okay, so now I know that she dies sort of not long after this. It kind of also sets a new context for the book. I realise that sounds like I've just spoilt it. In some ways I have and I haven't, but I think I recommend reading them both in tandem anyway. I think it's a really beautiful coupling of books. For the next one, I won't go into tons of detail because I just sort of spoke a bit about it in more detail in the Republic of Consciousness long list video that I made recently. But 5 Days Untold by Badr Ahmad is from a small press from Dar Arab Publishers, and they're a small press who publish a lot of works, particularly work that was sort of originally published in Arabic. And this is a story around war and around a lot of brutality. It's a difficult read, and I didn't always fully enjoy it. I didn't always fully necessarily get on board with it, but I also think there's something really powerful behind it, which is just how this book really explores the sort of the numbing effect almost of something like war, or these sort of huge moments happening in people's lives, how it kind of just wears people down. And I think this book does that quite well. And it sort of, as you go, it kind of just slowly feels like we're watching characters sort of break in front of us and sort of try and work out new realities. So yeah, really quite a difficult read at times, and not always my favourite, but I still think it does a lot of really interesting and good stuff. Next up, I read Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell, and I'd been kind of hovering around reading both this and just really anything else by David Mitchell anyway, partly because I read, and I kind of had mixed feelings about Cloud Atlas. Like, I mostly enjoyed it, but there were some bits I was like, I don't think I'm clever enough for this. And Number 9 Dream, which I didn't really get on with and just sort of felt a bit alienated by. And Utopia Avenue, I was like, oh great, more of this. And actually, I was pleasantly surprised, because I read this as part of a local book club, and it was the kind of kick I needed to go and read it. And I mostly listened to this on audiobook, and I think in some ways that was a better approach for me, maybe for David Mitchell more generally, but also just, I think, for a book that's sort of almost, 550 pages, something like that. But this book, it largely basically follows a band going through the 1960s, or the late part of the 1960s. So this real kind of microcosm, this very, very specific time in history, and multiple characters refer to this being a very slim part of history. And we do get quite a lot of walk-on parts and kind of cameos of various people from the era. So we at one point meet some of the Beatles, and we've got Frank Zappa and Joni Mitchell's there in the background. And we meet Mama Cass and who else? Lots and lots of people. Anyway, basically any musicians you can think of from the US or the UK during the kind of late 60s, they're pretty much in this in some form. David Bowie is there, and it's also great listening to the audiobook, because one man is trying to do every single voice and trying to casually be Mama Cass and also be David Bowie, and also 4 different band members who all have very distinct voices and accents. And does a really impressive job, I think, of handling all of that. But it is sort of a little bit, like, as we sort of were saying in the book club when we discussed it last night, a lot of people kind of saying like, yeah, after a while, it feels more like it's a sort of a fan service or something that David Mitchell himself is really enjoying. And part of that is part of the appeal, I think, is that David Mitchell seems to be really having fun writing this book. He's really kind of getting into the mind of some of these characters and enjoying having, you know, Mama Cass randomly appear and give some sage wisdom. Yeah, share her sage wisdom with everybody else. But I think overall I did really enjoy it. We watched this band kind of start to become successful. We watched the sort of pitfalls that happen to them. There's also a sort of side plot that becomes a bit bigger, where one of the characters is having sort of quite significant mental health issues is maybe not the word. We are sort of meant to sort of see it as some kind of possession by some kind of spirit or some kind of being, and that radically affects obviously his ability to not only be in the band but sort of his wider life. Fraser Simons over at Springboard Thought has been sort of doing quite a fun project of looking at how David Mitchell's books interact, because there is sort of a world that is created amongst all of his novels, and there'll be little flashbacks to things. So we get a character in this book called Jasper de Zoet, who is a relative of Jacob de Zoet, who is featured prominently in the book The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, also by David Mitchell. So we kind of have these linking parts, so it is kind of one big world. Almost like, you know, if you imagine like a video game, there's like a hub world, and these sort of books kind of have little branches off them, off that hub, and that's kind of how they connect. You know, it might be that there's a character who appears once and there's sort of a bit of time travel, and they also sort of hear, somebody at the book group last night was saying at one point there's a book where a character says, you know, a character receives a phone call, and is sort of like, what's this? Like, what, you know, why are you calling me? I'm just a shop owner. And then 4 books later, we find out that, you know, we see the person who made that call, and they've been told, you know, if you're ever in trouble, ring this number. Those sorts of interactions. So really quite interesting and bizarre book. And in many ways, I overall really enjoyed it. I found it very readable and very fun. I don't know if I necessarily get the wider metaverse thing that's happening in this. Still enjoyed it overall. I still think it's really fun. So yeah, there we go. And I maybe this is sort of slightly breaking the curse. I don't know. I may be up for reading more David Mitchell again, but I'm still not sure. I'm in a bit of a mid space on that. And then I also read 2 advanced copies of books that are coming out shortly, at least in the UK. So the first of those, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Deesha Philyaw. So this, I think, has been out in the States for a while now, but in the UK it's due to come out in May. And this is a collection of short stories that feel sort of almost connected. They're very much still in the same world, but those short stories are all around, as the title suggests, what various women or various characters who are associated with the church do in their spare time. And for many of them, the sort of secret aspect involves sort of sex and relationships and affairs, and it's a really fun collection in the sense that these are groups of characters who are just sort of really exploring themselves and their identities. Some of them are quite poignant. There's one that's all just about somebody falling sort of in love or lust at kind of first sight, but then really struggling to understand how to approach that relationship, feeling quite nervous around the idea of being in a relationship, and particularly about potentially being hurt, and then kind of going in from that. So and then we also have short stories in this that are about there's at one point 2 women who are sort of in a sort of sexual relationship, but one of them is sort of very convinced, like, oh yes, but I will find a good church going husband. And it's this sort of cognitive dissonance of almost not really understanding what's going on, or sort of somehow thinking like, this is just a really nice temporary thing, and then I'll go and get a nice husband, without really exploring it, or at least hiding from herself what that actually looks like. So really interesting and quite fun there as well. And the second book that I also got as an advance copy is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. And I've not read anything else by her so far, and I really want to after this. I really enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. So this is sort of a little bit... bear with me when I start describing what it is, because at first this maybe sounds like an off-putting description given everything that's going on at the moment, but it is a pandemic novel. It is looking at sort of ideas of time travel and about history and rewriting history. I mean, like, very pressing and important themes for right now, but also not really an escapist read. Like, ooh, more characters living within a pandemic. I wonder what that feels like. But what I thought was really interesting about this book was it's really short, and it kind of just flew by. Like, I read this pretty much in one sitting on a long commute. And the whole idea is that basically we sort of pass through bits of history, and there are little hints that we're about to get into some time travel stuff, because at one point a character sort of says something about, like, it's you know, I think early 2020, and a character says something about oh, you know, make sure you know, that thing going on around Wuhan, and this character's like, what? And they're like, oh yeah, sorry, we're still quite early into 2020, don't worry, you know, ignore it. And I was sort of reading this being like, hang on, are we to suppose that there's some time travel stuff going on here? Oh yes, indeed. And what I thought was then really quite fun and interesting was how the book then explores that. Like, what would you do if you could go back in time and tell people to prepare in a certain way for a pandemic? Would you? And particularly if that's someone you deeply care about. But then the sort of moral grey area of telling one person and not being able to tell everybody is a whole other thing. You know, one person being really prepared and as a result maybe not dying or not having people around them die during a pandemic, only to kind of, yeah, leave everybody else out in the meantime, which I thought was really interesting and really well explored. And then there's also a novelist writing in a sort of in the future, who kind of, in some ways, there's a bit of a, I'm not, you know, I think any author writing about an author in a book is always going to be open to people asking if that's them. And I think in some ways it feels like it could be Emily St. John Mandel, in the sense that there are these little things about, you know, like, oh, you know, you published a couple of books and some of them did really well and all these sorts of things. And, like, you know, I think one of the books describes something around a Ponzi scheme, which I believe happened in her last book. So just lots of these little sort of things, but yeah, I thought it was really entertaining and really interesting, and I was surprised just how much I was engaged in this book. Actually, I was fully expecting, I basically was just planning to read about 20 or 30 pages, maybe a bit more, on this commute and sort of see how I went, and then I was like, oh no, this is really interesting, actually, I'm just going to carry on reading, and read the whole thing. Yeah, it's a good one. I think it comes out in late April, so the 28th, I believe, of April. It's due to come out in the UK. Last but not least, one I almost forgot because I finished it just the other day, is The Instant by Amy Liptrott. And I really enjoyed her last book, The Outrun, which is a non-fiction book with Amy Liptrott talking about how she sort of, just after coming out of rehab for alcohol addiction, then sort of moved herself basically back home to the island of Orkney and tried to re-establish sort of herself in this community where not only is she sort of more physically cut off from the rest of the world because it's a bit more remote and everything else, but actually that also comes with all these other challenges around her feeling cut off from alcohol and from other things, and suddenly being on a small island where most people know your business, but without things like alcohol or other things that she might be able to lean on, and without many of her friends around, was a real challenge. And I really enjoyed that book, and it focuses a lot on nature, particularly her sort of observing these birds, and that kind of connects in, and that's actually, it also won the Wainwright Prize for nature writing for that reason. And in The Instant, this is sort of a follow-on where she's now moved to Berlin, and is exploring a lot around her life. And what I thought was really fascinating about it was this sort of how she negotiates things like her alcohol addiction with things like dating. So, you know, obviously going on dates many times, you know, dates start in bars or you know, might go to a bar afterwards or something like that. You know, often, at least in sort of Europe and the US, that is very often linked with alcohol. Most of those spaces involve alcohol, and so a bit around her engaging with that, but also her addiction to alcohol almost becoming a different addiction instead. And so she falls in love with a man, and she almost becomes addicted to this relationship. So when he stops messaging her, or when he sort of breaks things off, she becomes obsessive, trying to research him and find out where he is and talk to him and all these other things. And she signs up for a course that's going to teach her all about how to get someone back and all of these things. And it's really interesting reading it because, and the audiobook is narrated by the author, is listening to her then talk about a real reckoning with herself, about realizing that she's replaced one addiction for another, realizing that what she is doing is really unhealthy, and is not gonna serve her or this man or anybody else particularly well, but also just this absolute isolation she is starting to feel being in Berlin. You know, she doesn't speak much of the language. She was going to German classes, but then stopped those to take on a job that she needed, just to keep paying rent. But then that now means that she feels further isolated because she's now working with lots of people who are also sort of outsiders to society, in this place, and at the same time is not really practicing her German, so she kind of feels so distant and cut off, and that triggers more of her kind of addiction and issues. I will say at times this book can, by the sheer nature of what this book is about, it can feel a little bit self-involved, you know, whereas something like The Outrun also has bits where she then goes and talks about nature. Obviously this book is a lot more about her inner thoughts, and so I can totally see, and I've seen from some reviews on Goodreads, that people were really put off by the fact that it is all just about one person and it's kind of quite self-involved. But also I think that's sort of an interesting part of it, because the addiction to this man, and these addictions and dealing with those ghosts, is in itself something that has to be dealt with in a way that involves thinking a lot about yourself and talking a lot about yourself, because it's sort of, there is something going on that you're trying to address. So in some ways this book feels a bit like her reckoning with herself, and it can be a lot in that sense, but it is a very short book, and I think is also very interesting and good at what it does. So I was really excited to see that Amy Liptrott had another book out, just because I really enjoyed The Outrun, and I think if you really enjoyed The Outrun, this feels like a really good companion book to that one as well. Anyway, I've really rambled a lot more on this one than I thought I would. I've been Bob, the book career, talking about some books. I hope you've had a good week. I hope you've been reading lots of really fun things. And I will be back shortly to talk more about some other books, most likely these two chunky boys, good old Books of Jacob and Tomb of Sand, which I am enjoying, but yeah, they are big. So I'll be talking about them soon, but I'd love to hear a bit more about what you've been reading this week, and if you've read any of the books that I mentioned in this video. I've been Bob. Take care. Speak to you all soon. Bye bye.